Hello, thanks everyone for joining us today for this Oxford Climate Society event on the role of behaviour change in responding to the climate emergency. My name is Eleanor Holton and I'm a neuroscience PhD student and action director at Oxford Climate Society. So we're a student society dedicated to holding educational events throughout the year and also working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate climate into the curriculum. This is the second event of our 8-week online series this term. So, as we know, responding to the climate emergency will require large-scale change from our systems of production to our energy use to how we communicate in a global world. While this is going to require new technologies, it is also going to require an enormous change in mindset and willingness to change our behaviour. So, in today's event, we will turn to behavioural psychology in thinking about some of the most challenging aspects of climate change. How can we get social norms and individual behaviour to adapt in the ways we need? I'm delighted to be joined today by two experts in this area. First, we will hear from Professor Elke Weber from Princeton University, who works in psychology and public affairs and holds the Gerard R. Andlinger Professorship in Energy and the Environment. And second, we will hear from Kevin Green, who is Vice President of the Centre for Behaviour and the Environment at RARE, an organisation which applies findings from behavioural psychology to various climate change-oriented initiatives around the world. So during this event, we will first hear from both the speakers, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll be receiving questions from the audience. So as always, please type any questions you have into the chat on the YouTube comments, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Weber.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for your great introduction. And let me just share my screen. All right. So as most of the people in the audience will know, we live in a time period called the Anthropocene. It's a time where our behavior, especially behavior with respect to energy, our energy consumption, the sources of energy we're utilizing, is changing the environment. The question is, how do we deal with a situation where our current behavior might make our continued existence on this planet somewhat questionable and much more difficult? When it comes to policy actions in that space, the ruling assumption is that these kind of decisions are made by Homo economicus, by rational decision makers, rational agents, rational citizens, who weigh pros and cons and act accordingly. If there's inaction, not sufficient action in the space, that means that there's an information deficit that we have to fill in with science. What I want to suggest as a psychologist is that we really are assuming the wrong animal, the wrong decision maker. We're not dealing with Homo economicus, we're dealing with Homo sapiens. And while we, Homo sapiens, certainly can make rational decisions, we have the hardware for it, but we have to basically sort of learn how to do that. We're not primarily creatures of rational deliberation. Instead, what comes natural to us is to work from personal experience, trial and error learning. We're creatures of habit. We use associations that are built up by past successes and failures and the associated emotions to guide our actions. And in addition to using our emotions, we also use guides, action rules, moral rules of conduct, standard operating procedures. Oftentimes, copying what other people are doing, we use imitation and rules to guide our actions, and in particular, social norms. So let me say a little bit more about both of those. And so it's the habits and the cognitive biases that sort of we exhibit as human decision makers, not as rational economic decision makers, that give rise to the phenomenon we see all around us, massive status quo bias. We're very, very hesitant to change our current ways of behavior, whether that is eating habits, or energy consumption habits. And typically, there's actually a certain degree of safety of staying with what we know, the devil that we know. Business as usual in many situations is a conservative strategy, because changing to something new oftentimes means there are uncertainties and we're not quite sure sort of what additional risks we're getting into. But it's actually certainly not true in the context of climate change. Sticking with status quo, sticking with business as usual is probably the most risky response we can exhibit. It's also certainly not true in the case of our current COVID pandemic we're dealing with. And so in those situations where status quo bias is not an advisable strategy, what do? And if it's not rational expectations and rational deliberation that gets us to change our ways of acting, to change our way of the economy, our change of being, what should we do instead? And should we then scare people into action if they don't do it by rational deliberation? And let's talk a little bit about sort of feelings and emotions and scaring people. And a number of years ago, with some colleagues, I popularized the term risk as feelings. While in many contexts, especially in more professional contexts, risk is seen as a statistic, as analysis. In other contexts, it's also seen as politics. For most of us, most ordinary human beings, we think about risk as something that scares us into sort of protecting ourselves. And a good almost 50 years ago, a group of psychologists investigated that in the context of nuclear power. And so nuclear power was being suggested as a much safer way of generating electricity in the United States, safer in terms of mobility, in terms of mortality statistics, generating a certain kilowatt hour of electricity. And yet the American public was not willing to embrace nuclear power as a source of electricity generation rather than coal. And so what these psychologists basically investigated was this discrepancy. How do experts feel about, in this case, sort of technological risk, nuclear power, and how does the general public, how do we, Homo sapiens, feel about these technological risks? And they came up with a two-dimensional space of these psychological risk dimensions that may or may not line up with mortality and morbidity, but that oftentimes drive actions much more than sort of these statistics do. And so on the x-axis, we basically see this emotional response, which they call dread. How scary is this particular activity? How much does it make us sort of feel worried, wake up in the middle of the night and want us to do something to reduce it? And then on the y-axis, we have the dimension of how known versus unknown is it? How known to science, how knowable are the consequences right away? And not surprisingly, nuclear power was basically sort of the poster child for something that was very dreaded and also seen as very, very unknown. And so in 2006, I stuck out my neck and said, well, one of the reasons why we don't do too much or not enough about climate change is because climate change is not seen as something that is dreaded. It's not the kind of risk that keeps us up in the middle of the night. And nobody, I meant this as a dare. I wanted people basically to redo this analysis that had been done in the 60s and 70s with nuclear power, but climate change was not on the horizon yet. But nobody did. So a couple of years ago, I had to do it with one of my PhD students, and we used the old items, the black ones on the screen. We added climate change. We also added some of the natural disasters that have become more frequent and more severe with climate change, and some other sort of new risks, like, for example, terrorism. And so one thing that you find, first of all, is that nuclear power has come way down. It's no longer sort of the most dreaded and most unknown, perceived as unknown risk, in part because it has been around for another 40, 50 years. And really not too many bad things have happened. Terrorism now has this category of sort of very, very dreaded and seen as very unknown. But as we predicted, climate change is definitely well to the left of the midpoint on the dread scale. We just recently repeated this by including also COVID, and not with all the other risks. So this was a much smaller survey, and it's only based on 200 Americans. But one thing that you see, based on this data at least, that COVID is actually as well to the right of the midpoint on the dread scale. So COVID actually is much more dreaded than climate change is, even though it's seen as not as unknown because we know much more about viruses than we know about climate change at this point. So the other thing about worry, about scaring people into action, is when you scare people about one thing, concern about other things tends to go down. And I called this in this 2006 paper, the finite pool of worry. The notion is that we have like a finite buffer, I guess, of emotional energy, of attentional energy. And when risk and concern and worry goes up on one dimension, it goes down on other dimensions. If it goes up on climate change, it might go down on terrorism. Just recently, we collected some data in a panel of citizens both in China and in the United States and in Italy. And here you sort of see that's a new concern that has come on in the last 2 or 3 months about COVID, about our health and safety with respect to this virus, actually has been crowding out concern about climate change. These negative lines that you see both in Chinese cities, in American cities, and Italian cities. This is attention by news media, but we get very similar responses also at the individual level when we ask people about those responses. One thing that's interesting is that associated fears, and so one of the consequences of the COVID pandemic is also economic uncertainty and economic risk with respect to employment, GDP, and the economy. And interestingly enough, sort of the associated risks actually don't get crowded out, but they get crowded in. And so that that sort of increases concern about related risk, but it decreases concern about unrelated risk. And so scaring people into action certainly doesn't come for free. It carries certain costs that we have to keep in mind. The other point I want to then briefly address is the notion of dealing with rules. And so Russian deliberation on the one hand, that's the assumption in the policy arena. And what I'm arguing on the one hand, it does exist, but it's not there exclusively. We also make decisions based on our feelings. And then the second point I want to make, we make decisions based on rules and norms of conduct. And both what we see other people do around us, descriptive norms, and prescriptive norms, what we believe other people want us to do. Yes, we certainly know that public policy support and policies both for climate change and for other factors are influenced by norm information. We can use norm interventions, sort of increasing what people believe other people are doing, supporting what other people are doing to reduce climate change, or what people should be doing. Those are useful in achieving stronger mandates for policies, or for increasing public policy support, public support for policy that might initially be costly, but pay off further down the road. And I think Kevin will say much more about that. And then the question is, well, what norms specifically matter in the policy arena? And right now we have a project in the field that looks at that. Is it the most directly related norms? Is it higher level norms that might have a larger impact on this behavior and on related behaviors to increase spillover effects, positive spillover effects? And also, do we want to increase, do we want to target norms that are desirable, norms that increase desired behavior? Or in many situations, we actually might want to discourage undesired behavior and use norms to address these undesired behaviors that might be increasing in large parts of the world, where many developing countries are trying to emulate developed countries in terms of the energy habits and their standard of living. And so let me just sort of end on a slide that has some takeaway from the COVID pandemic for climate action, for climate change action. And the first takeaway is that risk-as feelings and these feelings of dread do indeed drive willingness to act. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see more action on COVID right now, much more willingness to constrain our behaviors, to change our ways of going about our daily lives in the case of COVID than we have ever seen in the case of climate change. That drastic change in action is possible. It's amazing when the status quo is removed by, in this case, some external force, by some act of God, sort of how drastically life can change in a very, very short period of time. And then also with a strong motivation for change, with a strong goal of saving, in this case, human life, the cost of action has become secondary. And so costs, sort of when people talk about interventions, climate change interventions being too expensive, the question is always compared to what? And I think also importantly for both crises, COVID and climate change, the consequences of action appear only with some delay, and that makes it very hard for us to learn from experience. In the case of COVID, the delay is two plus weeks. It's relatively short, but we're going to find out in a relatively short period of time, but not immediately. Sort of what impact sort of our going out or staying in behavior has. The problem in the case of climate change is that delay is in the order of decades, years and decades, and so it makes it even harder. At the same time, and this makes both of these problems such wicked problems, early action is crucial. So early action is hard to evaluate because the consequences are delayed, and yet it's so crucial because sort of for the virus case, it grows exponentially, and the earlier we do something, the better. In the case of climate change, now we can intervene, but certain impacts on the environment will become irreversible down the road. Also, COVID worries do reduce our concern about climate change right now. And so therefore, it's important that there will be expert interventions and actually analytic effort to keep both of these in focus, because ultimately climate change probably is the most severe problem. We have a vaccine, hopefully in 18 months or so for COVID. There's no vaccine for climate change. And then lastly, the COVID experience hopefully will have some positive consequences, maybe increasing our trust in science and our trust in government and government intervention and our respects for experts. So thank you so much.
Sorry, thank you very much for that talk. So I think before we get to any questions, I'll just pass it straight over to Kevin. That's good by you, Kevin.
Sure, let me just pull it up here. Okay, so thanks, Eleanor, and honored to be doing this with Elke, who is a tremendous researcher whose work we use a lot in our work. As Eleanor said, I lead the Center for Behavior in the Environment, which is a global team that uses the science of human behavior to design solutions to big, hairy environmental challenges. So we really try to translate a lot of that brilliant work into action. And I should share first that a lot of my focus here will be on the US, as that's where a lot of our focus has been in looking at the data. But I hope you'll see a lot of the ideas, translatable across multiple geographies. And of course, it'll be interesting to talk in the discussion about what does and doesn't translate. So this is an image that probably looks familiar to not just the people in this gathering, but to a growing number of people around the world. In the US, we know, for instance, that more than 2/3 of people are now alarmed or concerned about climate change. And some of the messages that they're getting, look like the following. It's time to panic. And there's not much that little old you can do about it, except for wait for big transformational change. A bit scary. And there's also something to this argument that I would call a bit of a straw man. It's not necessarily wrong, but not necessarily right either. And that straw man argument can, in some ways, be summed up with this quote: "The story of climate change is so big that we can't solve it through small actions." Like I said, it's not necessarily untrue. Small actions are not enough, but it does a disservice, in a sense, when it attributes smallness to all actions. So let me clarify that a bit. So the argument relies fundamentally, I think, on two key premises. One, that the emissions impact of changes in individual and household behavior is too small to make a difference, and therefore not really relevant. And two, that the indirect effect of individual and household behavior change is ultimately negative because it makes policy response and other institutional change less likely. So it begs the question, how much should we accept these premises, and is there really nothing we can do but wait, aside from maybe vote or take to the streets? Maybe not. Our modeling shows that immediate adoption of behaviors like eating a bit less meat, reducing household food waste by 20%, or flying one less time by just 10% of relevant US audiences can have a bigger impact on emissions reductions than people probably appreciate. And again, this is just for modeling purposes. Here are several of those benchmarked against the US targets under the Paris commitment, just for a sense of scale. For sure, this isn't enough, but it would be a bit odd to say this is too small to be relevant. There's so much more to unpack here, but I'm just going to sort of say for now that at the very least that calls into question premise one, that changes in individual and household behavior are too small to make a difference and therefore not really relevant. What about premise two? This one is a bit trickier, and it's more of what I think of as an "it depends" scenario. One of the plausible reasons among many that some climate activists are wary of behavior change is that it's really hard to persuade people to change. There's also a worry that our attention is limited and that focusing on individual behavior will distract us from the larger institutional forces at play. A third is that our quote bad behavior will just sort of spill over into other areas through forces like moral licensing. So in other words, if we cut back on our food waste, we won't feel as bad about taking that next flight to a tropical destination. So, we definitely don't have time in this short conversation to pick through all these assumptions, and there's a lot of truth to be found in some of those assumptions. It's, as I said, it's not just a yes, no, it depends. So I want to just call something out that instead, what this reveals to us from our perspective is the importance of design, of building solutions that take advantage of the best information we have about how people make decisions to maximize the likelihood that they work. So what I want to do with just the remaining few minutes is share 3 really quick strategies informed by evidence for designing better behavior change for climate change. Again, just sort of as a taste. So, one of the things that, I said that we know is that, we're wary of behavior change because it's really hard to persuade people to change. Change is hard. Behavior change for climate change is really hard. Sometimes, we can think about human beings as probably the best problem-solving species that ever lived. Unfortunately, just not problems like climate change. We like problems that are really proximate, that feel really personal, and climate change is none of those things, right? Sometimes it feels, and this is a lot of what Elke was saying, it feels too out of reach. It's too big. It's very perfectly suited to be the exact sort of problem that we humans are not very good at solving. And so the question becomes, how can we make climate change more like the problems we are good at solving? So I'm just going to share a few ideas here informed by some research, including from Elke and her colleagues. First, instead of trying to change people's minds, we should begin to meet them where they already are. There's a phenomenon that a lot of people are familiar with called confirmation bias that basically says, that we actively seek out information that confirms what we already believe and ignore information which contradicts it. I see this play out every time with my family and my friends that I have an argument about something, a debate about something, and we turn to Google, of course, and we all just look for the first result that confirms our answer, which Google inevitably has for us, right? And so, we're looking hard for information that confirms what we already believe, and we also like to dig in when people try to convince us of a different opinion or even a different fact. And this is from our own research. There's interesting ways that this applies to climate. So this is from some research by a couple of colleagues of mine, Eric Tulin and Rahim Rakimov, who looked at predictors of intention to perform high impact pro-environmental behaviors. And the takeaway here, this is a graph of the regression coefficients for a number of possible predictors of whether or not people report that they intend to perform or adopt one of these behaviors that you see here: solar panels, green energy, carbon offsets, and electric vehicles, just to name a few. And the upshot here is we know that climate change is, particularly in the U.S. where I'm based, a very polarized issue politically. But it turns out that it's not the behaviors that we're talking about are not particularly polarized, in the sense that political orientation is not a very strong predictor at all of whether or not people report an intention to perform any of these behaviors. So whether or not you're in the US Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, does not say very much about whether or not you say that you intend to do these behaviors. So what that tells us is if we're talking about climate change as a subject or global warming, we know how people are going to respond depending on where they sit on the political spectrum. But that same thing is not necessarily true when we think about the behaviors that are relevant for addressing this. The second thing that I want to share is give people something to feel good about, and they're more likely to listen. So very briefly, one of my favorite examples of this is a study about chocolate cake. And a very, very quick summary is that the researchers who conducted this study gave chocolate cake to 3 different groups of people. And in one group, they told them to imagine how proud of themselves they'd be if they didn't eat the cake. In another group, they told them to imagine how ashamed of themselves they'd be if they did eat the cake. And in a third group, they didn't tell them anything about what emotional response they would have. And then they measured how many people ate the cake. There's obviously a lot more details of the experiment, but that's the quick summary. And the upshot is that those participants who were told to imagine the pride that they would feel in resisting eating the cake had a dramatically higher likelihood of resisting eating that cake. And the opposite effect was true in the case of shame. So these were working in opposite directions. Now that's a fun and interesting result because it's about chocolate cake, but it also is highly relevant to climate and environment and has been shown in similar studies, including by our illustrious panelist here, Dr. Weber, who will correct everything that I say incorrectly about this, hopefully, but essentially the same outcome. They looked at affective forecasting, predicting future emotional states in the context of pride and guilt, in this case, about whether or not you make a green choice, a green consumption choice, or an environmental donation, or guilt about not doing it. And they find a similar result. Anticipating one's positive future emotional state leads to higher pro-environmental behavioral intentions compared to anticipating negative emotions. And importantly, that suggests a pretty radical rethinking in the environment and climate space, which it's fair to say has traditionally favored inducing negative emotions such as guilt. As Elke said at the outset, we often assume that inaction means information deficit. And so those of us in the environmental field have been really, really good at giving people more information, giving people more facts. Unfortunately, that's usually bad news, which people don't really want to hear. And we've also been pretty good at making ourselves and others feel guilty about what we're not doing. And it's not clear that that is the most effective way to motivate people to change. Quickly, the third one that I want to share is to show people where the herd is going, and they'll go there too. So, Elke talked about descriptive norms. This is again showing the regression coefficients for the studies that my colleagues did on predictors of people's intention to do these pro-environmental behaviors. And what you see at the top here, what I'm highlighting now, is the strongest predictor among those we tested is whether the participants think other people are doing them, right? And this is what's called as a descriptive norm, what we think most other people are doing. And we know from lots and lots of research that descriptive norms are really, really powerful in terms of guiding our own decision making. We like to follow the herd. We are an inherently social animal who cares a lot about what other people are doing. Sometimes the descriptive norms aren't working in our favor, though, and most people are not doing the thing that we think they should be doing, in which case that can be working against us if we're trying to change behaviors for the climate. So there's some interesting new research from another one affiliated with Dr. Weber, Greg Sparkman and his colleague Greg Walton. This is when they were at Stanford. Greg Sparkman is now at Princeton as well. And they studied this phenomenon called dynamic norms. So if you consider the static norm, so they set up a study outside a cafe at Stanford University, and they asked participants to conduct to participate in a little survey outside the cafe. And then they measured how many participants then ordered meat-free meals, so vegetarian meals, essentially. And they used a couple of different types of messaging in that survey. In one case, they used this static descriptive norm. 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat consumption. So they just told participants that, and they had them answer some questions, and they measured how many participants ended up ordering meat-free meals. In the dynamic norm case, they did something slightly different. They showed people not where the herd is, but which way the herd is headed. So they said over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption. And the difference here is that when we hear where things are going, we want to go there too. And they wanted to test and see if this had a different effect. And sure enough, it did. Using the dynamic norm messaging had a significantly higher impact on whether or not people ended up subsequently ordering a meatless lunch, which shows that, as I said, if people know where the herd is going, they're going to want to go there too. So those are three quick strategies that we think about for designing better behavior change for climate change. Meet people where they already are, give them something to feel good about, and show them where the herd is going. That's it for me.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. They were both had some really interesting contributions to this really important topic. My first question, I've got quite a few, I've got a couple before we take questions from the audience, is about something that Professor Weber already mentioned, which is how COVID-19 might have changed the landscape in terms of making behavioral changes. So I know you already mentioned that there are some challenges imposed by it, you know, it takes up our worries and whatever, but we have seen a huge change in behaviors that are climate friendly in terms of having a huge cut in energy use, in fuel and oil consumption, and also a pause in global travel. And I was wondering whether you think this change in status quo would make it any easier in future for changing the status quo for different reasons, that is, for climate related reasons.
Kevin, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought she said that one was for you.
It's for both of you. Sorry.
For both of us. I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think sort of what I said at the beginning, that we learn a lot by personal experience, and that oftentimes, you know, sort of our behavior actually prevents, our status quo bias prevents us from getting the kind of feedback that we need, you know, to experience the benefits of sort of new ways of being. I think there the COVID virus has to come in very handy. And so we might have had fears, you know, as a company, for example, you know, to see sort of how much your sales might suffer if you don't send your sales force across the country to negotiate contracts, you know, or to promote products. But now we're getting basically a few months of free experience about what happens, you know, when we can't travel across the country. Or yes, if I'm serving on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you know, this big UN organization that investigates, you know, every 5 years, you know, what the state of our knowledge is on climate change and on both mitigation and adaptation responses. And each report basically meets 4 times, brings a few hundred researchers to different locations in the world, and uses up a lot of carbon in the process of doing that. And the notion always has been that in-person meetings were absolutely essential. We could not do it any other way. Well, we just had our first meeting online. And I suspect, yeah, and it was not perfect. There were some drawbacks, but there also was sort of the experience of certain benefits that you didn't have in the in-person meeting. So I think all of these experiences give us the feedback that we need to truly evaluate the pros and cons, you know, of more energy-friendly behavior that we didn't have before. Now, having said that, I don't think it's going to be sort of a panacea, and because also I think our current restrictions on travel, on affiliating with other people is building up, you know, this depletion, yeah, and so there probably will be like a huge rebound, you know, in travel afterwards, because people want to catch up on certain things. So I think, yeah, I think there will be hopefully some positive lessons, but I don't think we should sort of necessarily expect that everything will be just great because we had this experience.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I really agree. I think one of the biggest barriers that we tend to face in behavior change is, as Elke said, that you know, we prefer the devil we know, and in this case, you know, we now just are forced to know a new devil, like video conferencing, and so the status quo is almost shifting outside of our control, and so that's a big opportunity. And you see things like, you know, I'm sure, you know, most folks listening heard about the study in the UK that, you know, something like 9% of people wanted life to go back to the way it was before. So, you know, there's a lot of openness to change when people are sort of forced into these moments of transition. In our work in the field, we have seen scenarios where we work in a lot of remote communities around the world, and they tend to be at sort of the front lines of natural disasters. And when natural disasters happen, which are a terrible thing, nobody wants those to happen, but those massive moments of transition create an opportunity for lifestyle change that is orders of magnitude greater than the sort of little changes that people, the incremental changes that people might have been willing to do before, because there's sort of like almost a fresh start effect there as well. So I think that's certainly an opportunity, though, as Elke said, we probably shouldn't be too optimistic, because I think there are a lot of people who want, their old way of life back. Another thing that I think is really interesting about what COVID-19 has revealed for us relates to this premise, this idea that small individual actions don't matter, right? There's only big systemic change. But of course, one thing that this is teaching us, I think, in really profound ways, is that a system is made up of many, many, many individuals, and it's only comprised by their behaviors, essentially. And so, this is a sort of massive collective action problem that we haven't seen before, and we can now all see, we can feel that each of our individual decisions actually does have an impact on the health of our neighbors. And so I think in some ways, it has, as the journalist Michael Grunwald said in a recent Politico piece, COVID-19 has demonstrated this idea that individual action doesn't matter is fundamentally bogus. And I think there's some value to how it's helping us understand that.
Maybe you can just add to that also. I think it shows the importance of good political leadership, because as we rebuild our economy, for example, it's a unique opportunity, since the status quo has shifted, to rebuild in the ways that are consistent with a green economy. It's a huge opportunity, but I think that opportunity is seen much more clearly in Europe, for example, with Ursula von der Leyen's sort of view on how the stimulus funds ought to be spent, than it is, for example, in the United States, where that issue itself has become politicized, and sacrificing a huge opportunity in the process.
Great, thank you. So yeah, that last point on what role leaders should take in the future brings up another question, which is what role should governments and lawmakers in general, do you think, take in encouraging this behavioral change? So for example, the shift in public sentiment around smoking is a case where governments and policymakers in the past have led a sort of societal shift in mindset. So what are the conditions that allow these legal policies to shift social norms, and what can we learn about those for the climate emergency?
Shall I go first this time?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, one thing that we're seeing is that there is an important role. This is maybe building on Elke's last comment. There is an important role for governments in policymaking, in setting policy and making rules, and then enforcing those rules. And there are limits to what that can accomplish. And there's a great responsibility on governments as sort of societal leaders to shift social norms, shift the behavior of citizens without the traditional levers of regulatory enforcement, because it's very hard to do. I mean, I think we're seeing that in particular in the U.S., where it's very difficult to enforce these things, and in some political environments, more difficult than in others. And there's all sorts of questions tied up in that. So, that's where the role of leadership really, is revealed.
Do you want me to build on that?
Please. Oh, you know what else I was just thinking of? This is to set you up. There's some research on how long it takes people to accept new policies that Elke has conducted, and how that's very difficult from the perspective of a policymaker, because you may have a policy that becomes very, very popular after a certain period of time, but it's often longer than electoral cycles, and so it's very difficult for policymakers to get to have the incentives to make legislative or policy change. And it's possible that this is such a moment where the floodgates have been opened for enacting if we can find the right leadership, enacting policy change in a way that is much more palatable to people, just because we're in the midst of a crisis.
So, and this panel, this event is about individual action, and I think Kevin has pointed out very correctly that individual action does matter, and it's not a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket multiplied, by billions of times that a behavior gets executed, and the impacts are cumulative. But having said that, individual action also is not a panacea. There's basically no silver bullet in this game. It's not a carbon tax. It's not sort of other government mandates. It's not individual behavior. It's not companies sort of pulling together. The bottom line, all of these actions have to happen in parallel. And then the question is, what is the best sequencing, and what kind of actions can sort of positively affect each other, and build on each other? And I think oftentimes, sort of government action at the right point in time can make a huge difference. So companies might actually want to disclose their carbon risks, and they might want to divest, sort of from carbon, but they might also see in the short term that there is a competitive disadvantage to doing that, and they might be reluctant to do that. But if at the right time, actually, you have a mandate that sort of says, okay, at this point you must disclose, because it's in the public interest. That can have a huge impact, because all of a sudden you have a level playing field, and companies that want to do that because they have other objectives are able to do that by financial criteria. I think the same also sort of holds at the individual level. Just sort of finding out that other people are doing it, sort of makes it easier for you to do something that you sort of deep down might want to do, but see some disadvantages, maybe financial disadvantage in the short run too. So I think coordinating signals from all these different fronts in ways that maximizes impact, I think that's sort of in some sense what we have to concentrate on. And I think governments, certainly in the climate space, if you think about when do governments have a mandate to intervene, to tell people, how to change their behavior? It's when the externalities, I mean, you don't want to tell people what their preferences are, but when your own behavior starts to affect the well-being of others. In the case of smoking, we didn't have mandates about smoking, but we did have mandates about smoking when we became aware of secondhand smoke. And certainly it's true in the climate space as well. Our behavior has huge externalities on the well-being of others right now, and also in the future.
Great, thank you. So I have one last question before we turn to questions from the audience, which is, what is the role of economic incentives here? So in behavioral economics, people often discuss these crowding out effects, where when you start to put a price on ethical actions, you can often actually undermine the intrinsic motivation people might have to do the right thing, and introduce a commercial mindset to it. So I was wondering when economic incentives should be used for changing climate-related behaviors, and this, in relation to kind of government policies as well.
Kevin, it's your turn.
Sure. I mean, I think I would mostly repeat what you already said, Eleanor, which is that we have to be really thoughtful about motivation crowding. It's really an interesting area. We tend to think that these sort of levers that we can use to influence behavior are additive. So if we layer a policy change and material or economic incentives and social influence on top of one another, it just becomes additive. It becomes more effective. But as you noted, there's a lot of research that motivation can be crowded out when extrinsic incentives are implemented. There's examples of when, in a couple different countries, when fines have been instituted at daycares for picking up children late, that late pickups actually increase. There's a famous story from the fire department in Boston, Massachusetts, here in the U.S., where when the fire chief instituted costs to sick days for firefighters, the sick days went like way higher, because, and that's a really interesting one. You can sort of make sense of that in your head, because a firefighter showing up for work when they're not feeling well, there might be a strong intrinsic motivation to do that, because they know that they're saving lives, right? They're not in this business to make money. They are, they are doing a social good. they may enjoy it and everything also, but they may be incentivized to go to work to save people's lives. But when it just becomes a personal cost that can be quantified, it's quite a bit different. So, we try to think really carefully in how we layer on extrinsic or material incentives into designing solutions, and it's never really that simple. But I think we do. There's a lot of, when it comes to climate related behaviors, and some of the behaviors that we talk about, like getting your household energy from solar or renewable sources. If you are a car owner, we have many car owners here in the U.S. If you are a car owner opting for an electric vehicle, these are things that are relatively expensive. They're getting cheaper all the time, and it's important from the perspective of that material incentive. It's important for those to keep getting cheaper, right? The technology has to keep getting cheaper to make it doable for people. But that's not going to get you all the way there, right? And so, our theory is, in some cases, the last mile to adoption is going to be more in these sort of social influence categories. When I start seeing that other people are doing it, or when I, know that other people can see that I'm doing it, then that's what's really going to get us over the hump to adoption. Some folks probably know there's been some research here in the U.S. I don't know if it's been in Europe as well. Where the biggest predictor, the most likely predictor of whether or not you have solar panels on your roof is not things that we might expect, like age, income, race, education, et cetera, but rather whether or not your neighbors, whether or not people around you also have solar panels on their roofs. And so those are the things that are going to become those kind of last mile incentives from my perspective.
Yeah, no, well said, Kevin. And I think basically 2 points. One of them is, that economic incentives matter, but oftentimes might crowd out other incentives, and that might actually be more effective in certain contexts. But then the other thing to maybe add and emphasize is that even for economic incentives, behavioral science can make a huge contribution on how they're being implemented. And so a subsidy, for example, is so much more effective at time of sale, like for an electric vehicle, than if it's given as a tax refund, when you file your income tax. And so, what we know about individual mental accounting, and people's desire to encode certain things as gains or as losses, makes a huge difference.
And maybe just to add one thing to that, the other thing about economic incentives, almost by definition, is that they can be expensive. They cost, somebody's got to pay for them. And so in some cases, it may not necessarily be a choice of which one is effective and which one isn't, but which is more cost effective. And there's a study by some of our collaborators in California where the utility in Santa Clara County was installing devices on household HVAC units to reduce demand during peak hours to prevent brownouts. And a technician has to come into your house or your apartment to install those devices, and you got to schedule it. And so there's kind of like some transaction costs, some barriers to having it done. But even if the utility pays for it, people really weren't doing it. They weren't signing up for this. And so they tried some incentives, like getting people, like putting up sign-up sheets in apartment buildings. And when they put people had to put their names on the sign-up sheets, there was a dramatically larger effect to people signing up because it was observable, right? I could see whether or not my neighbors were doing this pro-environmental thing, and that had a big impact. And in addition to that, they found that the impact of that observable sign-up list was about 7 times as effective as a $25 cash incentive. So offering people $25 was not as effective as just a very cheap sign-up sheet. And in fact, if you extrapolated from that, they didn't actually test this, but you could imagine that means that it would cost something on the order of, if you use that math, on the order of $175 or more to pay people to get that same effect from the sign-up sheet. So sometimes it's just a lot cheaper to use social influence.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I am going to ask one more question, because just out of interest, which is, how much do you think it's important to try and make people care about these of course it is important to get people to care about future generations, but firstly, how is it that we can bring people to sort of empathize with people across the world in the future, with this notion of kind of psychological distance. In some ways, they're the furthest away. The people who are going to be the most affected by climate change are often quite far away from us, both in time and space. So do you think, are there ways in which we can get people to care more about this? And is it necessary, if you're thinking that in some ways a better strategy is just by getting these norms going where we're not even trying to change sort of the reason why people are doing it?
So I have another paper that I like a lot that looks at the effect of making people proud about the past to make them care about the future. And yeah, so the notion is that, so that I think there are lots of different ways and lots of different reasons why people might care about, sort of distant others, or including sort of distant others in time, future generations. And some of it has to do with altruism, and some of it has to do with empathy. But oftentimes, just sort of thinking about environmental investments as an investment into the future, including our own future, sort of in our own space and time in municipality or country. And investments in the future only make sense if you think that the future is going to be there. It doesn't make sense to invest in your house if you're going to die tomorrow, because you're not going to sort of basically get the personal benefits if you're not of the altruistic persuasion. And so how do we convince people that the future is there and the future is valuable, and get their focus on the future? Because we tend to focus on the here and now, because that's much more important. It turns out that one way of doing that is to make people sort of aware of having had, they themselves, their family, the municipality, their country, a long and illustrious past, because they think sort of whatever happened in the past is going to reflect it in the future. So a longer past means a longer future. And again, it might not be entirely rational, but there's lots of evidence that people think that way. And so I think, sort of to answer your question depends a little bit on what segment of the population you're addressing. But even for people who don't have these altruistic motives, or don't have a lot of empathy for people in faraway places, just having them invest into their own future, in their space and time, can be done.
That's a great one. I would just add two small things to that. One is, this is maybe a bit of a trope, but stories matter. We care a lot more about stories than we do statistics, and there are traits that we all share as human beings, and dreams and ambitions and relationships that we all share as human beings that we can all relate to, even if we're if we're halfway around the world. And so there's this phenomenon with I think a kind of unfortunate name, but it's called the identifiable victim effect, which is just essentially what I said, which is that when we can identify that individual or that story of the individual who is affected, it's much more likely to motivate us than if we see statistics that from a rational perspective are much more significant because they represent greater numbers or something like that. And so that's one. I would also say we may not have to worry about that much anymore, because none of us can hide much longer from the effects of climate change. And so everybody everywhere is feeling, just about everybody everywhere, unless you live in like northern Vermont or something. I don't know if the folks in the UK will get that one, but maybe Scotland would be the right analogy. Everyone's feeling it now, and so there's going to be stories that we can all relate to, and it's getting a lot closer, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. So the first one I've got is, do you think that there are more tangible or relatable metrics to communicate about the risks of climate change than the ones we use now, which are in terms of 2 degrees or sea level rise, or
Yeah, sure. I mean, anything that gets a phenomenon closer to us, right? And so, I mean, this very much relates to Kevin's last point, that so we are all seeing the effects of climate change, and so we're seeing the effect in terms of birds, sort of migrating earlier or later, sort of certain birds not showing up anymore, effect, on growing season, and when we plant things, and so I think just sort of showing people within their own lifetime, sort of how these metrics that matter to their own actions, to their own sort of ways of making sense of their environment, how they have changed, I think that could make a huge difference.
Yeah, I agree. Anything's better than than some of, what does a metric ton of CO2 look like? That's pretty tough for people. So I think there are a lot of ways that um, you know we could help ourselves by thinking of more relatable metrics. I actually think this is slightly oblique, but one of the better things that we can do, regardless of what the actual metric is to demonstrate relative consumption and use that as a metric of comparison for people. So I might not know what a metric ton of CO2 looks like, but if, I do know if I do know the relative difference of numbers, and I can read whether or not my metric ton emissions are greater than my friends or something. And so it's the use of sort of the relative comparisons from a social influence perspective that I think can be really powerful. There's a company in the US, there might be something comparable or even better in Europe, called O-Power, that worked with utilities, energy utilities here in the US, to redesign their statements that they send to their electricity consumers, to just include the simple information about how homeowners' electricity consumption is comparing to their neighbors. And so you could just see whether or not you understood kilowatt hours. You could see whether or not you used more than your neighbors. And that really motivated people. And then they also designed in really simple feedback, like smiley faces or frowning faces, to show if you were doing better or worse than the month before. And these really simple forms of communication ended up having major impacts in people's electricity consumption. So sometimes it's not so much the absolute metrics themselves, but the sort of like relative comparison that we can really understand and really relate to.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of add to that, I think this notion of a personal carbon footprint and the ability to measure that and the ability to see improvements on that falls very much into that same category. And yeah, the notion that what we measure sort of directs our attention, but then also the desire to do better. I think that's like a very basic human motivation. That's one of the reasons why video games are so addictive, because there's always a chance in the next round you can do better than that. And so if we change our CO2 emissions into a giant video game, I think gamification sort of has a lot to be said.
Great, thanks. So this next question actually builds, I think, on a bit of what Kevin just mentioned, which is actually, so how you can influence people's behavior in places where people are generally indifferent towards climate change. So how to enforce positive behavior when the problem can be easily dismissed. So I think especially, if you don't already have those, if relative doesn't matter because there is no one who cares who you can be compared to, where do you start?
Well, it turns out that many of the actions that are good for carbon emissions and climate change also have like a whole range of other co-benefits. And so those include, for example, reducing your red meat consumption has health benefits, huge health benefits, or shifting to renewable energy sources has huge air quality benefits, that are making life miserable in large parts of India and China right now because of air pollution. So I think sort of focusing on those co-benefits, and finding out the right co-benefits for the communities you're addressing that actually that are concerns to them is another very easy way in which we can sort of target our climate change interventions and messaging.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a great point. And in addition to that, a lot of these have benefits for your wallet as well, right? Some of them require, major upfront costs that aren't, accessible to everybody yet, for sure. And so a lot of, the ability to produce your own, renewable energy, or, if you're looking at purchasing electric vehicles or something like that in places where, you need a car, those can be quite expensive for people, even though the life cycle analysis tends to show that over time, they are also good financial decisions. But a lot of these, they just really benefit your wallet. My favorite example is food waste, which it surprises a lot of people is a tremendous contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, a much bigger part of our individual and societal greenhouse gas emissions than I think anybody really tends to realize. And you just save money if you reduce your food waste. You just spend less on food, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So there, as Elke said, there are these alternative motivations, that I think are still quite relevant for people, and that's convenient that it just so happens. There's this famous cartoon that everyone's seen now that's like, it's a debate at a big climate change convening, and one of the guys stands up and says, what if we're wrong and we make the world a better place for nothing? Or it's something like that, right? It's like, all these things they have a lot of reasons that they're, that they're good. And I think one of the insights that we can benefit from is that we don't necessarily always have to start from we can be wary of starting from focusing only on changing people's minds about climate change, which not only may not be effective, it may further entrench people in their existing viewpoints, and it may not be necessary.
Great, thank you. So I think this next question is requires a bit of knowledge about social psychology, but this individual is asking, what do you think of Milfont's findings that link social dominance orientation or acceptance of inequality with the likelihood of performing pro-environmental behaviors? Is that, yeah.
If Elke can't answer that one, then I'm not sure anybody can.
So this gets us to another definition of risk. We talked about risk as a statistic, risk as politics, risk as feelings, but there's also risk as culture. And there's actually a famous book by Mary Douglas, a British sociologist, sort of 30 some years ago. They talked about that sort of what is being seen as risky by a certain sort of segment of the population, by a certain culture or subculture, are the kinds of things that threaten your way of being. And so that means that sort of you see technological risks as very threatening if you live in a more egalitarian culture and have egalitarian values. But if you believe in hierarchies and social hierarchies and domination of other individuals and domination of nature, you don't sort of see these things as risks, but you see them as opportunities. And so there's no question that sort of our basic social values, including on dimensions as hierarchy and egalitarianism and a range of other categories, sort of really influence what we see as valuable and what we see as threatening. And so absolutely, there's no question that sort of, just as political party affiliation is a proxy for some of these values, if we go more directly to those values, we will see these kind of differences even across political parties.
Great, thanks. So our next question is there any information on how different groups experience various incentives for behavior change differently? So farmers versus students, and also how these identities may intersect?
This is perhaps an insufficient answer, but I'll just say that there is certainly evidence that those differences exist. And it's very hard to generalize, and that just means the importance of testing is really key. The same intervention or the same idea can have completely opposite effects in different groups, because these sort of like generalizable features about human motivation and decision making can be, they are, at the level of like stylized facts, they're generalizable, but they end up being manifest in very, very different ways. And so I think, actually some elements of the last example, that there are these different societies that have, different perceptions of, values from egalitarian to dominant. But those are the sorts of things that can be, human traits can be manifest in really different ways. And so one of the really, really key elements of what we do is just test everything at a small scale, sometimes at low resolution, to see what sticks, what resonates, what we can learn from it, and what we can make better, because it's hard to predict. It was sort of an answer without an answer.
But it was a white one.
Okay, so in light of COVID's new focus on health, what can we do to pair health and pro-environmental behavior change?
I would just say, I think Elke, answered some of it before. There are, there are enormous health benefits, not just for the planet, but for our species of, making a lot of the changes that are necessary, both in the short term through things like the food that we consume, or the air that we breathe, and the long term, of just, if we don't have a planet, a hospitable planet to live on, then that's probably the least healthy outcome of all for our species. So they're almost inextricable.
Yeah.
And from a practical perspective, I just think Elke can probably cite more research on this, but from a practical perspective, it is often more motivating for people to respond to health messaging because, it's a little bit better on dimensions of like hyperbolic discounting, right? We can feel health impacts a little bit sooner, although things like heart disease take a long time. And so, sometimes it resonates with people more than just this sort of abstract notion of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, that sort of the COVID crisis has really shown us the interconnectivity of our global communities, and the virus knows no national boundaries. And the same is true of climate change, and this whole notion about retrenching and sort of closing borders and just looking out for number one, whether that's sort of me or my country, that clearly doesn't work. And I think the COVID shows that, and it doubly doesn't work in the case of climate change. And it doesn't matter which of the many metrics of benefits we're looking at, whether it's health metrics, or environmental metrics or economic metrics.
Great, thanks. So our next question is, should we call for a unified response from all countries in addressing climate change? Is this going to be a plausible solution, and how can we make all actors agree on it? Sort of moving out of the realm of behavioral psychology now. But
That's right. You also have one of the IPCC authors here with you, so she can have opinions on this too.
So the basic answer is yes. I mean, ideally we would do that. The question is how to do that. And of course, this is what the bodies like the UN have been doing. The conferences of parties, that sort of meet or used to meet once a year. They would have been meeting in Glasgow, I guess, sometime soon. But meeting once a year sort of to basically sort of get 196 or 197 countries around the table to agree on climate action. It hasn't always been easy. I think part of it is because there's politics, there's equity considerations, historical equity, who caused this, who should be paying for it, who should be paying the cost for it now. And more local politics, rivalries between China and the United States, whatever it might be, or coalitions that are getting formed. So the question is how to get countries to agree. And I think Paris, to some extent, was the limited success that it was because the countries agreed on starting with voluntary contributions. And this is a nice parallel at the international level to opt in, opt out at the individual level. Sort of basically opting in means that you decide what to do. Opting out means that you're assumed to be a contributor. But if you don't like it, you can take your choice and play elsewhere. And I think Paris to some extent was an opt-out agreement in the sense that everybody agreed. We made these national contributions, but there were commitments. It was not a legal contract. And so down the road, if we had, as a country, found that it was not in our own best interest, we could have reduced those contributions. And the idea was that we would do this voluntarily, and we would be doing it because we were not committed to it. But then the next year we would find that these contributions were not sufficient. We would ratchet things up. That hasn't quite happened, and it has. There are lots of external reasons for that. The change in presidency in the United States didn't help, and lots of other factors. But I guess the short answer to the question is yes, it's a great idea, but it's not so easily done.
Agree.
Great. So someone is asking what the key tipping points are, which for making behaviors morally unacceptable in the context of climate change. For example, flying lots or eating lots of red meat.
Well, this very much gets to norms, right, Kevin? You should take it away.
Yeah, I mean, tipping points is a tricky one, because we often want there to be some sort of specific point in the adoption process across a population that it just becomes sort of self-replicating, and we want that that tipping point or that critical mass to be some knowable entity, like 20% of people, and then the thing just snowballs on its own. And from a theoretical perspective, I think the idea of a tipping point or critical mass is compelling. It's just really hard to know where that is, and so we have to work toward these ideas of social norm change and social influence, because basically, you look at the way we like to talk about this is, if the data that I showed on those handful of behaviors in the US and the contribution that they'll make if 10% of the relevant audiences in the US were to immediately adopt them from a modeling perspective, what the impact of that would be benchmarking against the Paris targets. That shows the contribution of just adding up all the individual behavior. And so that's one way to evaluate this sort of behavior change idea. But I think it's really important to note that the impact of individual and household behavior change can be orders of magnitude greater than just that quantitative impact of an individual. Actually, my emissions reduction from switching to renewable energy, if it becomes observable, if I'm able to leverage my own behavior to create social influence, to make it more likely that those around me will adopt that behavior. And so, if you think about, it's interesting to think about the COVID-19 and how we talk about the likelihood, the data on the likelihood that I spread it to those around me and how we want to reduce that as much as possible. There's a little bit of a contagion effect with behaviors as well, in that my behavior can spill over into lots of others around me. And so I'm not sure that there is a specific point at which reducing food waste becomes crosses a tipping point and becomes self-replicating, and then everybody starts doing it. But every single individual that makes that change themselves increases the likelihood that others do as well. And so, there is that social contagion effect.
I think it also interacts with structural changes. I mean, essentially, tipping points is a concept that comes out of complex adaptive systems, and it refers to sort of a change that sort of puts you into a different state, and it's not so easy to reverse that getting from that state back to the previous one. So you basically sort of get stuck in that state. And so I think sort of in the case of behavior change, you have to think about, sort of, is there like an increase in a certain kind of behavior, like recycling behavior or composting, for example, that then also results in structural changes, sort of in the kind of infrastructure that we put in place to accommodate, larger demand, for these kinds of services, that then sort of basically would make it less likely for things to switch back. So it's not a perfect analogy, sort of from the physical space into the social space, but I think all the things that Kevin said would contribute, to that. But it's hard to know what the critical levels are. It's not like in a physical system where in a climate system, once sort of you reached a certain increase in temperature, basically sort of ocean circulations sort of change, and that's a point of no return. We don't have sort of these physical analogies in the social space.
Yeah, and I'll just share that, like in our work in small scale fisheries around the world, for instance, we're working with relatively small fishing communities where fishing is essentially an individual activity, and everyone's just trying to catch as much as they can. But with a lot of coordination, a lot of collective action, what fishers are able to produce out of the water can actually increase for everybody, but it requires a great deal of coordination. It's a collective action problem, much like solving climate change is a collective action problem. And we see from this work, there's a lot of sort of value changes that have to happen to start to get the shifts amongst the fishing community and the fishers themselves to be willing to adopt this new management regime, this new sort of paradigm But it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? Because as Elke said, you're already sitting in an equilibrium in which everybody's doing what they're doing, and if anyone, there's just too much incentive to defect. And so you need these sort of, once you've gotten that sort of shift in willingness, you need a sort of event almost to coordinate the shift in behavior and get you into this new equilibrium. And so there's kind of a combination required of this, like, this increase in willingness or intention to do these things. And then I think, as Elke said, a lot earlier in this conversation, a moment at which, the barriers are removed such that people are willing to make the change and willing to make the transition, so that you can wind up in a new equilibrium where, collective action is the norm. But it's very hard, one person at a time to get that.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, what do you believe are the most effective policies? And I'm guessing this means sort of actual case studies that have been implemented by governments to incentivize low carbon behavior.
Well, let me put in a plug for my home country, which is Germany, and the feed-in tariffs that were put in place, almost over 20 years ago in 1998, that basically sort of took the risk out of individuals and companies' investments in solar energy, in photovoltaic solar. And because the government was now guaranteeing utilities were required to guarantee a certain level of profit, for your investment. And you didn't have to sort of worry about not doing it now, but sort of in 2 years' time, when prices became cheaper, because whatever electricity you generated that you didn't consume yourself, you could feed back into the system at exactly the cost that you were incurring at the time. Now, what that meant is, it tremendously increased the volume. So it's an example of industrial policy, rather than sort of the economic policies of carbon tax, which is considered much more effective. But the effect that it had is, there was a tremendous uptake in volume, which brought down prices. And then China got into the game and produced things even cheaper. So the fact that solar and solar electricity at this point has become cheaper than coal is largely because of the feed-in tariffs in Germany at the time.
Yeah, great, thanks. I had one more question of my own as well, which was how it seems like for the climate crisis, a huge factor in getting people to change is just the uncertainty involved. Like, you can't really give people absolute definitive answers of what will happen if they fail to change their behaviors. So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about how to deal with changing behavior under conditions of high uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's a little bit a question of analogies, right? And so under conditions of high uncertainty, what do we do in other contexts? Well, we're not quite sure when we're going to die, right? And what impact that will have on the well-being of our families. So what do? We buy basically insurance. We insure against the worst case scenarios down the road. And one way to think about climate change action is essentially as an insurance policy. And so yes, I mean, there is a huge degree of scientific uncertainty about the effects of actions, about the future states of the world. Will future generations be better off or worse off, and so on. But to think about thinking about worst case scenarios and ensuring against those, and looking, there's a whole body of work on robust decision making, where we come up with strategies that will do well under all possible states of the world, rather than optimizing for this one state of the world. But we can only do if we know what the future will look like. So there are ways of both framing climate action in this insurance context, and also modeling frameworks going forward that we make better decisions collectively under those circumstances.
I was just thinking it'd be really interesting to continue to track, the matrix that you shared, Elke, of dread and uncertainty about climate change itself and about the phenomena associated with climate change. It'd just be interesting to track how that has changed historically, and then how it will continue to change, because obviously it seems like it's becoming less and less an issue of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. 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 Great. Thank you very much. I think that's about all the time we have for questions today, but thanks very much for both our speakers for two extremely interesting perspectives on such an important topic. And we'll be back next week for a discussion of race and class in a time of crisis with Sunita Narain. So this will be at 12:30 next Monday, the 11th of May. So see you then, and thanks very much for coming. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor.